In the winter of 1791, 17 people died in Boston under circumstances that defied all medical explanation. Their deaths were linked by a single, horrifying commonality. Each had read the same manuscript in the days before their demise. The document would become known as the most dangerous piece of literature ever to surface in colonial America. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Chronicles of Dread so you never miss these forgotten histories. Boston in 1791 was a city struggling to define itself in the aftermath of revolution. The cobblestone streets, slick with December ice, echoed with the footsteps of merchants and laborers who moved through their daily routines with careful precision. The harbor carried ships laden with goods from distant shores, but also whispered rumors that seemed to multiply in the cold air like frost on window glass. This was a time when superstition and reason walked hand in hand through narrow streets, when educated men spoke confidently of progress, yet crossed themselves at unexplained phenomena. The winter that year arrived early and stayed long, blanketing the city in an oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even the church bells. The manuscript first appeared on December 3, 1791, at Whitmore's print shop on Fish Street, a narrow establishment wedged between a cooper's workshop and a tavern that catered to sailors fresh from the harbor. According to the surviving records of proprietor Samuel Whitmore, meticulously maintained ledgers that would later become crucial evidence, a hooded figure entered his establishment just before closing time, carrying a leather satchel that appeared to have been aged by decades of harsh weather. The stranger, whose face remained hidden beneath a deep hood despite the warmth of the shop's interior, spoke little during the brief encounter. Whitmore's account describes a voice that seemed to come from a great distance, though the figure stood directly before his counter. The visitor requested only that Whitmore examine the contents of the satchel and consider them for publication, offering no details about authorship, origin, or compensation. When Whitmore opened the satchel, he found a collection of pages bound in what appeared to be vellum, though the material felt unnaturally cold to the touch, despite having been carried close to the stranger's body. The binding was simple yet elegant, secured with leather cord that had darkened to an almost black hue. The entire document emanated a presence that Whitmore would later struggle to describe adequately. Whitmore's personal journal, discovered in the basement of his former shop during renovations in 1847, provides a detailed account of his first encounter with the manuscript that would haunt Boston for months. The pages were yellowed with age, their edges brittle as autumn leaves that crumbled at the slightest touch. The ink, a deep burgundy that seemed almost black in candlelight, possessed an unusual quality that made the text appear to shift and move when viewed peripherally, as if the letters were somehow alive and aware of being observed. Most disturbing was the smell that emanated from the document, a mixture of damp earth, rust, and something else that Whitmore could never adequately describe, but compared to the scent of fear itself made manifest in physical form. The odor seemed to cling to anyone who spent time near the manuscript, lingering on their clothes and skin long after they had left the shop. The manuscript contained no title page, no author's name, no indication of its origin or purpose. It simply began in the middle of what appeared to be a larger work, with a passage that would later be transcribed by multiple witnesses before the document's eventual destruction. The handwriting was elegant yet somehow unsettling, as if each letter had been formed with deliberate, predatory precision by someone who understood that words could be weapons more deadly than any blade. Within hours of the stranger's departure, word of the mysterious manuscript spread through Boston's tight-knit community of printers, booksellers, and scholars with the speed of wildfire through dry timber. The city's intellectual elite, always eager to examine new works and expand their understanding of literature and philosophy, began arriving at Whitmore's shop in increasing numbers. Thomas Hartwell, a respected antiquarian known throughout New England for his expertise in rare manuscripts and ancient texts, was among the first to request a viewing. He arrived at Whitmore's shop on the morning of December 4th, drawn by reports of the document's unusual properties, and convinced that his decades of experience would allow him to determine its true nature and value. After spending merely 20 minutes examining the text, Hartwell emerged from the shop pale and trembling, his usual composure completely shattered. Witnesses reported that his hands shook uncontrollably, as he attempted to describe what he had read, claiming the manuscript contained words that should not exist in any earthly language, arranged in patterns that seemed designed to unlock doors in the human mind that were meant to remain forever sealed. Dr. Cornelius Reed, a physician and amateur theologian whose rational approach to medicine had earned him respect throughout Boston's professional community, visited the shop that same afternoon. Reed had built his reputation on scientific inquiry and logical deduction, approaching medical mysteries with methodical precision. Yet his encounter with the manuscript left him visibly shaken, his scientific worldview challenged by phenomena that defied explanation. Reed's later testimony, recorded by the Boston Town Watch in their official investigation, described texts that seemed to reach from the page with invisible fingers, grasping at something vital within the reader's mind and refusing to release its hold. He reported feeling as though the words were not merely being read, but were actively reading him in return, examining his thoughts and memories with an intelligence that felt distinctly malevolent. By December 5th, nearly a dozen individuals had examined the manuscript, each emerging from their encounter fundamentally changed. The transformation was visible in their faces, which bore expressions of profound unease that their words could never fully convey. Some spoke of passages that appeared to address them directly, using their names and referencing personal details despite the document predating their births by decades. Others described sections that seemed to shift and change between readings, revealing different meanings with each examination, as if the text were a living entity capable of adapting its message to each reader's particular fears and vulnerabilities. The manuscript appeared to possess an almost predatory intelligence, tailoring its content to exploit the specific psychological weaknesses of whoever dared to examine its pages. Edmund Forrester became the manuscript's first confirmed victim on December 8, 1791, though his death would not be immediately connected to the mysterious document. A clockmaker by trade and a man of methodical habits whose precision had made him one of Boston's most respected craftsmen, Forrester had spent the previous day at Whitmore's shop reading the manuscript from beginning to end in what witnesses described as a state of intense concentration that bordered on obsession. Forrester's examination of the manuscript lasted nearly 4 hours, during which he seemed oblivious to the world around him. Other customers in the shop reported that he appeared to be engaged in silent conversation with the text, occasionally nodding or shaking his head as if responding to questions or arguments presented by the author. When he finally looked up from the pages, his face bore an expression of profound understanding, mixed with absolute terror. Forrester returned to his workshop on Beacon Hill that evening, where he spent the night surrounded by the dozens of timepieces that represented his life's work. His apprentice, Jonathan Mills, found him the following morning in circumstances that would haunt the young man for the remainder of his life. Forrester sat at his workbench, surrounded by every clock in his shop, all stopped at precisely 3:17, a time that corresponded to no significant event anyone could identify. The clockmaker's body bore no signs of violence, no indication of disease or physical distress. Dr. Reed, summoned to examine the corpse, could find no medical explanation for Forrester's death. The official cause was recorded as failure of the heart, though Dr. Margaret Hale, who assisted in the examination, noted privately that Forrester's face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror that suggested his final moments had been filled with unimaginable horror. More disturbing were the words found carved into Forrester's beloved workbench, etched with one of his own precision tools, in letters so deep they had split the seasoned wood. The hour of truth has come and cannot be undone. The handwriting matched samples of Forrester's penmanship exactly, yet those who knew him swore he would never have damaged his workbench, which he had treasured as the foundation of his craft. 3 days after Forrester's death, Margaret Coyle, a seamstress who had read portions of the manuscript during a brief visit to Whitmore's shop, was discovered in her home on Salem Street under circumstances that defied rational explanation. Like Forrester, she showed no signs of physical trauma or disease, yet her death was surrounded by phenomena that challenged every assumption about the natural order. Coyle was found in her bedroom, but every mirror in her house had been shattered from within, the glass fragments arranged in precise geometric patterns on the floor that resembled no known mathematical or religious symbols. The arrangements were too complex and deliberate to have been created by random breakage, yet no tool marks suggested human intervention. The patterns seemed to draw the eye inward, creating an optical illusion that made observers feel as though they were falling into infinite depth. Most chilling was the piece of fabric found clutched in Coyle's hands, a sample of silk on which she had embroidered a message in thread so fine it could barely be read without magnification. "It knows my name and speaks it in the darkness between heartbeats." The embroidery work was exquisite, representing hours of painstaking labor, yet none of Coyle's neighbors could recall seeing her work on such a project. The deaths continued with horrifying regularity over the following weeks, each victim displaying the same lack of physical trauma, combined with circumstances that suggested their final hours had been spent in the grip of supernatural terror. William Prescott, a merchant who had skimmed several pages of the manuscript while waiting for other business at Whitmore's shop, died in his counting house, surrounded by ledger books, whose pages had been torn out and arranged to form symbols that resembled no known alphabet. Sarah Bennett, a minister's widow who had read the document's opening passages out of scholarly curiosity, was found in her parlor, seated in her favorite chair with every book in her extensive personal library open to pages that had somehow become completely blank overnight. The books, which had contained everything from religious texts to poetry collections, now held only empty white pages that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Dr. Abel Hutchinson, a professor of natural philosophy, who had examined the manuscript in hopes of providing a scientific explanation for its reported effects, died while seated at his desk, surrounded by mathematical equations written in his own hand that described impossible geometric relationships. The equations covered every available surface in his study, written in increasingly frantic handwriting that suggested their author had been driven by desperate compulsion rather than scholarly curiosity. By December 20th, 7 people had died under circumstances that shared the same inexplicable pattern. Dr. Reed began documenting the symptoms exhibited by those who had encountered the text, creating what would become the most complete record of the manuscript's psychological effects. Reed's detailed medical notes describe a progression of mental deterioration that followed a disturbingly consistent timeline, regardless of the victim's age, social status, or previous mental state. Initial exposure to the manuscript produced feelings of unease and disorientation that victims initially attributed to the document's disturbing content rather than any supernatural influence. Readers reported experiencing vivid nightmares featuring scenarios described in the text, dreams so realistic and detailed that they questioned whether the events had actually occurred. These dreams often involved personal encounters with deceased family members or friends, who delivered messages of warning or despair that seemed to come from beyond the grave. Within 48 hours of reading the manuscript, victims began exhibiting signs of paranoia and hypervigilance that interfered with their ability to function in daily life. They claimed they were being watched by unseen observers who remained just beyond their field of vision, describing the sensation of eyes upon them even when they were completely alone. Many reported hearing whispers in rooms they knew to be empty, conversations conducted in voices they almost but never quite recognized. The psychological symptoms intensified rapidly during the 3rd day following exposure. Victims described seeing movements in their peripheral vision that vanished when directly observed, shadows that moved independently of any light source, and reflections in mirrors or windows that did not match their own movements. These visual disturbances were accompanied by an increasing sense of dread that seemed to emanate from within their own bodies. The manuscript itself defied easy categorization, representing a work that seemed to exist at the intersection of philosophy, theology, and something far more sinister that contemporary scholars lacked the vocabulary to describe. Those brave enough to examine its pages reported that the text appeared to be a meditation on the nature of death and consciousness, yet its content seemed to adapt and respond to each reader's particular psychological makeup and personal history. Reverend Joshua Blackwood, pastor of the Old South Church, and a man whose theological education had prepared him to confront spiritual darkness, attempted to study the document in hopes of determining whether it represented some form of occult practice that his congregation should be warned against. Blackwood approached the manuscript with the confidence of someone who had spent decades studying religious texts. Blackwood's surviving notes, discovered hidden behind a loose stone in his church's foundation during renovations in 1847, provide the most detailed and systematic description of the manuscript's content available to historians. His account reveals both scholarly rigor and growing psychological distress as he attempted to catalogue and understand what he was reading. According to Blackwood's careful transcription, the manuscript began with what appeared to be a clinical meditation on the moment of death, describing in precise anatomical detail the sensations experienced as life departed the human body. The writing demonstrated an intimate knowledge of physiology that seemed impossible for the document's apparent age, referring to bodily processes that would not be understood by medical science for decades. The text's description of death was both beautiful and terrifying, using language that seemed to make the reader experience rather than simply read about the described sensations. Readers reported feeling their own heartbeat slow and their breathing become labored while examining these passages, as if the words were somehow inducing the very symptoms they described. The second major section dealt with consciousness existing beyond physical death, presenting philosophical arguments that challenged both Christian doctrine and emerging scientific understanding of the human mind. Rather than describing a traditional afterlife of reward or punishment, the text suggested that the soul remained trapped in a liminal space between life and death, fully aware of its situation but powerless to influence the physical world. This portion was written in a style that made readers feel as though they were experiencing this trapped state themselves, creating sensations of suffocation and helplessness that lingered long after the reading session had ended. The author described consciousness as a prison from which death offered no escape, only a different form of confinement that was infinitely more terrible than physical existence. Most disturbing was the manuscript's final section, which Blackwood described as a calling forth of that which should remain forever hidden from mortal understanding. This portion appeared to be written in multiple languages, some recognizable as Latin or Greek, others in scripts that no scholar in Boston could identify, despite the city's considerable intellectual resources. Readers reported that this final section seemed to address them personally, using details about their lives, their fears, and their relationships that no earthly author could possibly have known. The text demonstrated knowledge of private conversations, secret shames, and hidden desires that its readers had never shared with another living soul. Mrs. Elizabeth Thornton, wife of prominent merchant Charles Thornton, provided one of the most chilling accounts of this phenomenon. She described reading a passage that mentioned her deceased infant daughter by name, referencing private conversations she had shared with the child during her final moments. The text seemed to suggest that her daughter was not at rest, but remained conscious and afraid in some undefined space between worlds. Dr. Reed documented similar reports from other readers during his investigation. The manuscript appeared to possess comprehensive knowledge of personal tragedies, family secrets, and private fears that its readers had carried silently for years. It used this intimate knowledge to create a sense of cosmic violation, suggesting that privacy and personal autonomy were mere illusions. Several readers reported that the text seemed to respond to their thoughts in real time as they read, with new sentences appearing between passages they had already examined. Others described seeing their own handwriting appear in the margins, containing thoughts they didn't remember having, but recognized as emerging from the deepest recesses of their unconscious minds. As the death toll mounted and panic spread through Boston's educated community, Professor Nathaniel Ward, a scholar of ancient languages at Harvard College, emerged determined to solve the mystery through rational investigation. Ward represented the emerging class of American intellectuals who believed that reason and empirical observation could explain any phenomenon, no matter how mysterious or seemingly supernatural. Ward had spent his career studying ancient texts from cultures around the world, developing techniques for analyzing documents that could reveal their true origins and purposes. He was convinced that supernatural explanations were simply covers for phenomena that science had not yet developed the tools to understand properly. Ward's investigation began with systematic interviews of those who had encountered the manuscript, but survived their experience without succumbing to death or complete psychological breakdown. His detailed notes, preserved in the Harvard College archives, reveal a mind struggling to reconcile empirical observation with phenomena that challenged every assumption about the relationship between literature and reality. He documented the precise symptoms exhibited by manuscript readers with the thoroughness of a medical researcher, tracking the timeline of their psychological deterioration and looking for patterns that might reveal the document's true nature. Ward's early notes reflect confidence that careful analysis would reveal the manuscript to be an elaborate hoax, or perhaps an early experiment in psychological warfare. On January 2, 1792, Ward finally examined the manuscript himself at Whitmore's print shop, bringing with him a collection of scientific instruments and a detailed protocol for observation. His journal entry from that evening provides a chilling account of his first direct encounter with the text that had already claimed so many lives. Ward's initial observations confirmed many reports from other witnesses, yet he initially attributed the manuscript's unsettling qualities to psychological suggestion rather than supernatural influence. He noted the document's unusual physical properties, the strange coldness of the pages, the shifting quality of the ink, the disturbing odor, but theorized that these could be explained through chemical analysis. However, Ward's rational explanations began to crumble as he continued his systematic examination over the following days. His journal entries from the weeks that followed reveal a gradual descent into the same psychological patterns he had observed in other manuscript readers. Despite his scholarly discipline and scientific training, Ward found himself experiencing the nightmares and paranoid thoughts that had characterized previous victims. More disturbing was Ward's discovery that the manuscript seemed to be actively changing in response to his investigation. Passages he had carefully transcribed during his first reading appeared completely different when he returned to verify his notes, not merely altered, but rewritten in ways that directly addressed his academic theories about the document's origin and purpose. Ward's investigation took on an increasingly desperate quality as he realized he was experiencing the same progression of symptoms he had documented in other victims. His methodical approach gave way to obsessive behavior, as he found himself returning to the manuscript compulsively, unable to focus on any other academic work or personal responsibility. The professor's last coherent notes describe his growing conviction that the manuscript was not merely a text, but some form of conduit that allowed malevolent forces to reach across the boundaries between different states of existence. He theorized that the document served as a bridge between the world of the living and some other realm where consciousness persisted after death, but in forms too terrible for living minds to comprehend. On January 15th, Ward was found dead in his study at Harvard College, discovered by a colleague who had come to check on him after he failed to appear for scheduled lectures. Like the other victims, Ward showed no signs of physical trauma, yet the circumstances surrounding his death were deeply unsettling. Every book in Ward's extensive personal library had been removed from its shelf and stacked in precise pyramidal structures around his body, creating a geometric pattern that seemed to focus attention on the chair where he had died. His final notes, written in increasingly erratic handwriting that bore little resemblance to his usual careful script, consisted of a single phrase repeated hundreds of times across dozens of pages. "It knows what we are and what we will become." Ward's death transformed local concern into citywide panic. As word spread that even a respected Harvard professor had fallen victim to the document's influence, the educated elite who had initially dismissed the deaths as coincidence began to take the threat seriously. The Boston Town Watch found themselves investigating a case that challenged every assumption about crime and causality. The manuscript's reign of terror came to an abrupt end on January 20th, 1792, though the circumstances of its disappearance remain a subject of historical debate. According to official records, a group of concerned citizens led by Dr. Reed and Reverend Blackwood decided that the document must be destroyed before it could claim additional lives. The group gathered at Whitmore's print shop on a cold January evening, determined to burn the manuscript in a ceremony that would end its deadly influence. However, when they arrived at the shop, they discovered that both Whitmore and the manuscript had vanished. The print shop stood empty, its doors unlocked with no sign of struggle or hasty departure. Whitmore's personal belongings remained in their usual places, and the day's receipts were still in his cash drawer, but the man himself had disappeared as completely as if he had never existed. More unsettling, none of the neighbors could remember seeing Whitmore leave the shop, despite several claiming they had been watching the building throughout the day. Alternative accounts of the manuscript's disappearance emerged in the weeks following Whitmore's vanishing. Some claimed that a hooded figure, possibly the same person who had originally brought the document to the shop, had been seen entering the building in the early hours of January 20th. Others reported strange lights emanating from the print shop's windows during the night, accompanied by sounds described as whispers or weeping. Mrs. Catherine Mills, who lived across from the print shop, provided what may have been the most accurate account of the manuscript's final night. She claimed to have been awakened by sounds of movement in Whitmore's shop and had watched from her window as a procession of figures emerged from the building. According to Mills, the figures appeared to be the manuscript's victims, Forrester, Coyle, Prescott, Bennett, and the others, walking in single file toward the harbor. Mills's testimony was dismissed by authorities as the product of grief and fear, yet her description of the figures matched the appearance of the dead victims with unsettling accuracy. She claimed that Professor Ward was among them, carrying what appeared to be the manuscript itself. The procession moved with unnatural silence, their feet making no sound on the cobblestones as they disappeared into the darkness near the docks. Mills watched until they vanished into the winter fog, where even the harbor lights were barely visible. She never saw them return, and no trace of their passage was found despite extensive searches. No trace of Whitmore or the manuscript was ever found. The Boston Town Watch investigated the disappearance for several months, but their efforts yielded no evidence. The print shop remained empty for several years before being purchased by a baker, though the building's reputation ensured that business remained poor. The manuscript's disappearance did not mark the end of its story. Throughout the 1800s, rumors persisted of copies or fragments appearing in private collections throughout New England. These reports were never officially confirmed, yet several unexplained deaths bore similarities to the original manuscript deaths. In 1847, during renovations of a warehouse in Salem, workers discovered papers hidden behind a false wall. Among these were what appeared to be partial transcriptions of the original manuscript, copied in different handwritings. The transcriptions were destroyed after 3 people who examined them died under mysterious circumstances within a week. Similar discoveries occurred sporadically throughout the 19th century. A fragment was reportedly found in Providence in 1863, while another partial copy surfaced in Hartford in 1881. Each appearance was followed by unexplained deaths that matched the established pattern. The most significant rediscovery occurred in 1923, when renovations of the Old South Church uncovered Reverend Blackwood's hidden notes. These documents provided historians with the most complete account of the manuscript's content and effects. However, even Blackwood's second-hand descriptions seem to carry some measure of the original document's influence. Dr. Henry Morrison, the historian who first examined Blackwood's notes, reported experiencing disturbing dreams and anxiety attacks that persisted for weeks. Morrison's research notes describe his growing conviction that the manuscript had been more than mere text, that it had served as a conduit for malevolent intelligence that used written words to reach across boundaries between different states of existence. Modern scholars remain divided in their interpretations. Rationalists argue that the deaths were the result of mass hysteria combined with coincidental medical events. Others suggest that the manuscript may have been an early example of psychological warfare, designed to create panic through manipulation of fear and superstition. Yet questions remain that resist easy explanation. How did the manuscript appear to possess intimate knowledge of its readers' personal lives? Why did the death pattern follow such a consistent timeline? What became of Samuel Whitmore and the original document? The Boston manuscript case represents one of the most thoroughly documented yet inexplicable events in colonial American history. The survival of multiple first-hand accounts from educated witnesses lends credibility to reports that would otherwise be dismissed as folklore. Yet the very consistency of these accounts makes them more difficult to explain through conventional means. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is the possibility that the manuscript represents not an isolated historical event, but part of a larger pattern that continues to this day. The reports of fragmentary copies appearing throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries suggest that its influence may not have ended with its disappearance. In 1991, exactly 200 years after the original events, a Boston antiquarian dealer reported discovering what appeared to be pages from the original manuscript in an estate sale. The dealer examined the pages briefly before contacting authorities about their potential historical significance. He died of apparent heart failure 3 days later while seated at his desk. His assistant found him surrounded by books open to random pages, each containing handwritten notes that repeated the same phrase. The words, "Remember those who read them." The pages themselves vanished before officials could examine them, continuing the pattern of appearance and disappearance that has characterized the manuscript's legacy for over 2 centuries. The incident received minimal media coverage, dismissed by most observers as coincidental death given supernatural significance by those familiar with the historical case. Yet for those who study the manuscript case, this modern incident represents a disturbing possibility that the document's influence has not diminished with time. The pattern of discovery, brief exposure, mysterious death, and subsequent disappearance mirrors the original events with accuracy that suggests either remarkable coincidence or the continued existence of forces that conventional scholarship cannot understand. The manuscript's ultimate fate remains unknown, though theories abound among those who have studied the case extensively. Some suggest that it was destroyed completely, either by burning or through other means, and that subsequent reports represent either elaborate hoaxes or psychological suggestion amplified by knowledge of the original events. Others propose that the document continues to exist in some form, perhaps as fragments scattered among private collections or hidden in locations known only to a small group of individuals who understand its dangerous nature. The most disturbing possibility is that the manuscript was never a single document at all, but rather a manifestation of something larger, a force or intelligence that uses written language as a means of reaching across the boundaries between different states of existence. This theory suggests that the Boston manuscript was merely one appearance of a phenomenon that has manifested throughout human history in various forms, always adapting to the cultural and linguistic patterns of its intended victims. Historical records from other periods and locations contain scattered references to similar phenomena. Ancient scrolls that drove readers to madness in Alexandria, medieval codices that caused mass deaths in European monasteries, Renaissance texts that appeared and disappeared like phantoms in Italian libraries. Each incident shares common elements with the Boston case: mysterious origins, psychological effects that escalated to death, and physical disappearance that left no trace of the offending document. The pattern suggests that humanity has encountered this form of textual malevolence repeatedly throughout its recorded history, though each culture interpreted the phenomenon through its own religious and philosophical frameworks. What ancient civilizations attributed to curses or divine punishment, medieval scholars blamed on demonic influence, and Enlightenment thinkers struggled to explain through emerging scientific methods. Modern psychological research has attempted to explain such phenomena through concepts like mass hysteria, suggestion, and psychosomatic illness. These explanations provide rational frameworks for understanding how groups of people might experience similar symptoms in response to shared stressors or beliefs. Yet they fail to account for the specific details that made the Boston manuscript case so thoroughly documented and resistant to conventional explanation. The physical evidence associated with the manuscript deaths, the stopped clocks, the shattered mirrors arranged in geometric patterns, the spontaneous appearance of writing in victims' own handwriting, suggests influences that operated beyond the realm of psychological suggestion. These phenomena required physical manipulation of objects in ways that no known psychological mechanism could achieve, implying either coordinated human intervention or forces that science has yet to understand. Contemporary researchers who have attempted to investigate similar cases face significant obstacles. Academic institutions are reluctant to fund research into phenomena that challenge fundamental assumptions about reality, while the rarity of surviving documentation makes systematic study nearly impossible. Most scholars who express interest in such cases find their careers steered toward more conventional historical topics. The few investigators who have persisted in studying the manuscript case and similar phenomena report experiencing some of the same psychological effects described in historical accounts. Dr. Patricia Wainwright, a Harvard historian who spent 3 years researching the Boston case in the 1990s, abandoned her project after experiencing recurring nightmares and anxiety attacks that she attributed to prolonged exposure to the surviving documents. Wainwright's incomplete research notes, donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society before her departure from academia, suggest that the manuscript case was part of a larger pattern of textual phenomena that has appeared consistently throughout human history. Her work identified similar incidents in colonial records, from Salem, Providence, and other New England towns, always following the same basic pattern of appearance, psychological effects, deaths, and mysterious disappearance. The implications of Wainwright's research extend beyond historical curiosity to raise fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, the power of written language, and the possibility that human understanding of reality remains incomplete in ways that could prove dangerous. If the manuscript case represents genuine supernatural phenomena, it suggests that the boundaries between different states of existence are more permeable than modern science acknowledges. Alternatively, if the case can be explained through psychological and social factors, it demonstrates the extraordinary power of suggestion and belief to create physical effects that challenge conventional understanding of the mind-body relationship. Either explanation has profound implications for how humanity understands consciousness, communication, and the potential dangers lurking within the seemingly innocent act of reading. The manuscript's legacy continues to influence those who encounter its story, even at the remove of centuries and through second-hand accounts. The very act of researching the case seems to carry some measure of psychological risk, as evidenced by the experiences of scholars like Morrison and Wainwright, who found their investigations disrupted by unexplained anxiety and disturbing dreams. This phenomenon suggests that the manuscript's influence may operate through a form of conceptual contagion that spreads through knowledge rather than physical contact. The mere act of understanding what the manuscript represented and how it affected its victims may be sufficient to trigger similar psychological responses in researchers, creating a feedback loop that perpetuates the document's influence across centuries. The Boston case also raises questions about the responsibility of scholars and institutions when dealing with potentially dangerous historical phenomena. Should certain knowledge be suppressed or restricted if it poses psychological risks to those who encounter it? How do researchers balance the pursuit of understanding with the need to protect themselves and others from potential harm? These ethical considerations become particularly relevant in an age of digital communication, where information can be transmitted instantly across vast distances and to unlimited audiences. If the manuscript's effects could be transmitted through written description alone, the implications for modern media and communication technologies are sobering to contemplate. The manuscript case stands as a reminder that human knowledge remains incomplete and that there are aspects of existence that may prove too dangerous for mortal minds to comprehend fully. Whether interpreted as genuine supernatural phenomena or as an extreme example of psychological suggestion, the events in Boston during the winter of 1791-1792 demonstrate the power of written language to affect human consciousness in ways that challenge every assumption about the safety of the written word. What do you think was hidden within those pages? Share your theory in the comments, and remember to subscribe for more chronicles of dread from history's darkest corners.